All right, everyone, welcome to this presentation of Interstride and Duke University. Our goal here is to demystify the international student hiring process. My name is Scott Wallace with Interstride, and I'm honored to be moderating this great collection of panelists we have today. Once again, today's topic is demystifying the student hiring process. And before we begin, I want to thank Duke University for making this presentation possible. And a special shout out to Greg Victory, the Executive Director of the Career Center at Duke and their Assistant VP of Student Affairs. Also, everybody, a quick heads up about we have a poll question up. So if you could please answer that question, that way we'll have a better idea of our audience and we can best tailor this and future offerings. So without further ado, let's get to our panel. Aaron Blumberg is a partner attorney at Fragaman. Christina Kahn is the Director of International Student and Scholar Services at the University of Central Florida Global. We have Clifton Tay, the Global Lead for Early Talent at Roche. Nitin Agrawal is the founder and CEO at Interstride. And from Veris Insights, we have Scott Moore, their Director of University Recruiting. And last but not least, we have Yang Yang, the Associate Director of Global Careers at our host, Duke University. Our agenda today is really straightforward. Our panelists have each prepared a presentation, which they will share, after which I prepared some questions for our panel, and then we'll have a Q&A for you, our audience. And the idea is to give everyone some different perspectives on the world of hiring international students. Without further ado, our first presenter is going to be Christina Kahn. Christina, you have the floor. Take it away.
Wonderful. Thank you, Scott. And thank you, everyone, for joining us today. So as Scott said, my name is Christina Kahn, and I'm the Director of International Student and Scholar Services at UCF Global. I've been advising and mentoring international students for over 15 years, and so I'm happy to share some information with you all today. So first, we'd like to talk about just a brief overview of some F1 student employment options and to just do a really high-level overview and comparison of those. So first, for international students with the F1 visa, there's on-campus employment. So this is something that you can work on campus, you can gain experience, work experience, start to build your resume. There are some limitations in that it's limited to 20 hours per week maximum, but during winter break, during university breaks, typically you can work more than 20 hours per week. The great thing about on-campus employment is you can do this at any time during your program. And so it's a great way to earn some extra money, feel connected to campus, and again, start building the resume and developing some job skills. You don't need any special application or authorization. You already have on-campus authorization that's part of your F1 status. Now, curricular practical training, or CPT for short, is authorization to do an internship in your major that's directly related to your major before you graduate. So the limitations with CPT is it has to be tied to your curriculum. Now, I know that we have participants and students from many different schools, and so it's very important that you check with the International Student Services Office at your school to learn about the CPT policy, because it is handled differently at each school. But typically CPT, it's tied to your curriculum. You still need to be an enrolled student, and CPT is technically unlimited, but if you receive more than a year of full-time CPT, you won't be able to do OPT. So if you do a lot of internships, it'll be important to calculate your dates, but your international student advisor can help you with that. When do you apply for CPT? You can apply as early as after you've started your program and have been enrolled for an academic year. And all CPT has to be done before graduation. So this is something that you're doing while you're in the middle of your program. And again, the application procedure, it's going to vary by university. So check with your international student office for information about how CPT works at your campus. Now, optional practical training, OPT, is 1 year of authorization to work in your major that's done either before or after graduation. So before graduation, it's pre-completion OPT. It's a little less common. What we see most commonly is students applying for OPT after graduation, which is post-completion OPT. Some limitations is it's limited to 1 year, and we will talk about the extension for STEM majors in just a minute. And there are strict timeframes to apply to USCIS. For post-completion OPT students, you are applying up to 90 days before graduation, and you can also apply through your 60-day grace period, though we would advise you to apply earlier rather than later, not procrastinate. The procedure, it will require an application to United States Citizenship and Immigration Service, or USCIS. There's a filing fee, and it will be very important that you follow the instructions of your international student office at your campus, because you'll have to receive an I-20 and all of that. So those are kind of the main overview of 3 employment options available to F1 international students. Now for students, if we can go to the next slide. For students who have a STEM major that's on the Department of Homeland Security's STEM list, if your job meets a few extra requirements, you can be eligible for 2 more years of work authorization called a STEM extension. This is a really great opportunity for students who have earned a STEM degree in the United States. You do have to be on OPT to apply for a STEM extension. You apply before your OPT ends. The job requirements, there's a couple other requirements for it. Typically, it has to be a paid position, or you have to be compensated equally to similarly situated employees within the company. There's also a training plan that you would need to complete with the employer. But that's a really great option for STEM students to have additional work experience in the United States. There's another thing that's important for students to be aware of called the cap gap extension. So basically, if an employer has sponsored an H-1B visa, which I know Erin will talk about in just a moment, this can give you the option to either extend your status within the United States and possibly even your work authorization until your H-1B starts. So that's a really great opportunity for students as well. In terms of tips for international students that I'd like to share, it's so important to be proactive. In immigration, things are time sensitive, and also just in your job search to be proactive and not procrastinate and wait to the last minute. It's very important to be familiar with the different immigration regulations of your status, and also about the policies on your campus. So what is the CPT policy on your campus? What are the application requirements, so that you are aware of those and can take advantage of these opportunities? I'd also encourage students to take advantage of on-campus employment as well as CPT opportunities before graduation. This is an excellent way to gain job skills, work experience, leadership experience before you even graduate, and it helps you in your job search. And also use the services that are offered to you on campus, whether that's through your career services center or internship office. Sometimes they're separate. Other academic support, get to know your faculty members. They're all here to help support you to be successful. So take advantage of the resources that are available to you on your campus. And finally, don't underestimate the value of your soft skills. Obviously, you have technical skills, you're studying, you have this great degree, but you also bring so much to the table in terms of your soft skills, whether it's cultural competency, the ability to speak different languages, have the cultural knowledge. Like, there's so much that you bring to the table that brings so much value to employers. For university staff who might be tuning in, I would encourage you to really work to understand the unique needs international students have during their job search. International students have obviously restrictions in terms of employment, and so that makes the job search just a little bit more challenging. And so being familiar with their needs is really important. What I've found at the different campuses that I've worked at is forging strong collaborations between career services and the International Student Scholar Services Office is really key to helping students navigate the job search, but also understand the options that they have available to them. And it's also really important to develop programming and educational materials and partnerships to support international students, whether that's a guide for how to apply for OPT or even information for employers about how to hire international students who are doing CPT or who are on OPT, for example. And for employers who might be tuning in, I would just state that employing international students through CPT, OPT, STEM extensions is simple and it doesn't require sponsorship. So this is a really great way to bring incredibly valuable employees to your team without visa sponsorship. And international students bring tremendous value through both their technical skills and soft skills, like I mentioned earlier. So just a brief overview and snapshot. And with that, I think we'll move on to the next part of the presentation.
All right. Thank you very much, Christina. Well, I just want to, since we've had such a response of people joining, I want to make sure everyone's up to speed with what we'll be doing here today. My name is Scott Wallace with Interstride, and I'm going to be presenting this panel today. I just want to reintroduce our panelists for the folks who may be joined after we started. We have Aaron Blumberg. He's a partner attorney at Fragaman. Christina Kahn, who we just heard from, is the Director of International Student and Scholar Services at University of Central Florida Global. Clifton Tay is the Global Lead for Early Talent at Roche. Nitin Agrawal is the founder and CEO at Interstride. From Veris Insights, Scott Moore, the Director of University Recruiting. And of course, we have Yen Yang, the Associate Director of Global Careers at Duke University. This entire recording is going to be presented it's going to be available to everyone who's watching and listening here today. It will also be made available as a future episode of the Interstride podcast, which you can, of course, find wherever you get podcasts, Apple, Spotify, or interstride.com. And we're going to do panelist presentations from everybody. Then we'll have some moderator questions that I have prepared ahead of time. And then there'll be an opportunity for an audience Q&A. So do submit your questions into the Q&A app on the Zoom call here. And so without any further ado, thank you very much, Christina, for that great presentation. We're going to move on to our next panelist, who is Aaron Blumberg. You have the floor.
Excellent. Thank you, Scott. And thanks, everybody, for joining us today. Really just piggybacking off Christina's section, I want to kind of jump into what happens after OPT, CPT, and STEM OPT. So as Christina just mentioned, really employing someone like an F1 student that has CPT, OPT, or STEM OPT, that is easy. That we need to take advantage of. We need to leverage that because I've been an immigration attorney for about 15 years, and I can tell you it is not easy to work in the United States unless you're an F1 student. That's really the only time that it gets pretty easy. It's simple, it's quick for students to get CPT, to get OPT, and if they're a STEM major, science, technology, engineering, or math, they can get that STEM OPT extension and have OPT for up to 3 years. So students really need to make sure they're taking advantage of this. It's really good for employers because there's nothing they have to do, there's nothing they have to pay. With STEM OPT, there is some very, very, very minimal requirements and minimal paperwork, but it's very easy, especially compared to other things like an H-1B. So up on the screen, you have what I consider to be the ideal career path or immigration roadmap for students. Usually you come to the United States on an F1 student visa, you utilize your CPT and your OPT to gain experience, and then after that, that's where it gets a little tricky. And that's where an immigration attorney comes into play. That's where employer sponsorship comes into play. But after OPT is finished, most individuals that eventually want to stay permanently in the United States look to getting an H-1B. So we can move to the next slide. But the H-1B is the most common work visa. And what's great about the H-1B is that it's not specific to any certain nationality. It's not specific to any certain profession. Anyone is eligible to get an H-1B. However, you must be sponsored by an employer in a position that requires at least a bachelor's degree or higher in a specific field of study. So as you see up on the screen, F1 student, CPT, OPT, that's the easy part. The H-1B is a little bit out of the student's control, or now the employee's control, because you need that sponsorship. The employer also has salary requirements. There's fees to pay. And then to make it even more complicated, the government has not allocated enough H-1Bs to satisfy the needs of US employers. And so right now, immigration gives out only 85,000 H-1Bs each year, and that's new H-1Bs. And this past year, there was over 300,000 requests. So just think about that for a second. 300,000 individuals were sponsored for an H-1B, but there's only 85,000 available. So this is something that's really stressful and frustrating for both students and employers. You know, we see this now with the job market. It's really tough to find good talent. There's these international students that just got trained that are ready to work, but you have less than a 50% chance of getting an H-1B. So if you're an employer and you want to sponsor someone for an H-1B, you have to actually enter them into a lottery between March 1st and March 20th. The government holds a random lottery and selects 85,000 individuals that get their case filed. So if you get selected in the lottery, your employer can move forward and file the case with immigration and hopefully get it approved. If you lose that random lottery, and by the way, it doesn't matter if you were the top student in your class, doesn't matter if you have an offer to be executive at Google or Facebook or wherever it may be, it's completely random. And the only factor that can help you win that lottery is if you have a US earned master's degree. So are there ways to avoid this? What about going straight to a green card? So we can move on to the next slide and get into some of these issues. And actually, we can skip ahead again. So this is more basic information on the H-1B that I already covered. So yeah, you can jump ahead again as well. This is some of the statistics on the lottery, and we can go one more slide. So H-1B, just some real basics. Like I said, plan ahead March 1st to March 20th. Those are the only 20 days of the year that you can be entered into the lottery. If you win the lottery, you have 90 days to then file the case. If it gets approved, you can only work for the employer that sponsored you. And you have to be careful because your H-1B is not only specific to the employer, but it's specific to the job. And so if your job changes, you also need to be aware to amend or modify your H-1B. We can go to the next slide. So these are the obstacles summarized for getting an H-1B. And I know that I've gone over this quickly, and we'll get more when we get into the Q&A. But for a student, you have to find a job, which at least nowadays, that's probably the easiest part. But find an employer that's willing to sponsor you, willing to pay the H-1B fees, willing to pay you the prevailing wage salary, enter the lottery, win the lottery, that's the tough part, and then file the H-1B and get it approved. And by the way, most H-1Bs get approved. The denial rate right now is pretty low. So really the big issue is winning that lottery. Okay, we can go to the next slide. So if you don't get an H-1B, these are your other options. We call this the alphabet soup of visas. I'm not going to go through each one, but I'm going to point out a few really quickly. When you look at that screen, you see a lot of visas up there. But if you go one by one through each of them, you'll see that probably, I'd say at least 90% of students aren't going to qualify for any of those except for the H-1B. All right, we'll go to the next slide. So first, avoiding the H-1B lottery. Really, the only way to avoid the H-1B lottery is to get a job with an employer that is exempt. And there's three types of employers exempt from the H-1B lottery. Those would be nonprofit colleges and universities, nonprofit organizations affiliated with colleges and universities, and government or nonprofit research organizations. So it is a myth, not all nonprofits are CAP exempt, okay? It's nonprofit colleges and universities. And then another way to avoid the lottery is concurrent employment. An example there would be maybe a student wins the lottery and gets a job. Actually, I take that back. An example of that would be that you get a job with a university, which is CAP exempt, and then at the same time, you have a private employer that says, we want to also employ you at the same time on a part-time basis. So maybe they work for University of Central Florida on an H-1B sponsorship, and then Amazon says, we want to employ you for 15 hours a week as well. Amazon can file a concurrent H-1B, and they don't have to go through the lottery as long as you maintain that UCF employment. All right, so the next slide, there's 5 what I call magical countries where if you're a citizen, you can get a work visa outside of an H-1B. But there's only so many students that come from these countries. So you have Canada, Mexico, Australia, Chile, and Singapore. Those 5 countries have work visas that are specific to individuals of that nationality. So if you are a career advisor and you come across a student that holds one of these passports, you may want to, tell them, think about other options, because H-1B, as I mentioned, is going to be very challenging to obtain. And so for these individuals, they have another path towards staying and working in the US. Okay, next slide. Another option is that you could actually look to get employment abroad. So maybe you have a job with a multinational corporation, maybe Goldman Sachs, and they say, we'll sponsor you for an H-1B, but if you don't get it, don't worry, we'll transfer you to a foreign office, maybe London, maybe Singapore, work there for a couple years, and we'll bring you back. And they could bring you back on a number of ways. Maybe they keep entering you in the H-1B lottery, or maybe they bring you back on an L visa, which is for an intra-company transferee, somebody that's transferring from a foreign entity to a US entity. Obviously, that's a long-term plan for a student, and especially someone that wants to stay in the US. But I think this is something that in today's world, students really need to consider, is working for a few years in another country and maybe coming back to the US down the road. Okay, and then the next slide, this is just another visa option. This is the E1 and E2. This is for investors that want to start their own business. You see a list of countries up there. Only individuals who are nationals of those countries would be eligible to get it. And so it's a shame that this country does not have an entrepreneur visa. This is the closest thing we have. But what's really troubling is that countries where we see the most international students, China, India, Brazil, Russia, they're not eligible for this particular visa. Okay, and just last slide to wrap things up. What I have seen as some of the biggest mistakes students make in the immigration process. First, Christina already mentioned this. Don't wait till the end. I think that's just general advice for life. But the H-1B filing lottery window, 20 days a year. Every year I get clients that come to me at the end of March and say, I want to enter in the lottery. Well, you have to wait till the following March 1st. It's only once a year. Second mistake is not having backup options in place, and backup options need to sometimes be outside the US. There are great opportunities in Canada, Australia, Europe, Asia. You need to consider those because it is not easy staying in the United States. I can tell you that from many years of experience. Failing to save or retain copies of documents, this is something that's a no-brainer. Hold on to everything, keep it in the cloud, save it. And the last thing is make sure that you're only getting immigration advice from your F1 advisor, your J1 advisor, your immigration attorney. Be careful what you read online. All right, thank you, and I'll pass it back to Scott.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Blumberg. I told you we had a good panel, everybody. Next up, we have Clifton Tay. He's the global lead for early talent at Roche. Mr. Tay, take it away.
Thank you so much, Scott, and welcome everyone. So far, great information. I was listening to Christina. I was like, yes, 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 clapping my hands, listening to Scott. Yes, so I'm going to give you the perspective from an employer. And I think Aaron, you might want to plug your ears a little bit sometimes, or Christina also as well. But I'm going to give you kind of the back end, I think, of this process of when we come to schools to look for candidates, as well as when we work with different students, especially international. I'll also give you some perspective on US-based international students currently, as well as international students looking to work in the US. So we can go to the next slide, Scott. So from an employer perspective, I just want to give you kind of an update of what's happening today. We all know COVID has dramatically changed and drastically changed the work environment for everyone, working from home. The war for talent is great. It's still here. It's even, I think, more intense in some ways as possible. We've all heard of the Great Resignation. 4.5 million Americans have voluntarily resigned from their positions. So companies are hiring is the message I wanted to give to all these international students. You just need to know what industries to look into, right? And I'll kind of talk a little bit about that in a few slides. In demand, highly technical skill sets are where you'll typically find these companies who are hiring international talent. Just as we mentioned before, for STEM majors, there are OPT, CPT options that are available, the extensions that are available as well. And also companies are looking for talent educated in the US to return to their home countries. I was actually just on a call a week ago with our teams in Asia Pacific and Latin America, and we are actually developing a finance program to actually hire students from the US to return to their home countries. And also sometimes these opportunities offer more growth, and these roles may also be larger in scope or opportunity to own more in that case. So don't look at those opportunities as kind of less than opportunities in ones based here in the US. Go to the next slide. This is where I wanted to actually just kind of some things that I thought of when I looked at US versus international job searches. Look for companies that are advertising they're open to international students. Typically any company generally looks for international students. Of course, any company that works with the US government, of course, has US contract work is definitely a no-go. In my previous career, I worked at General Electric. We had contracted the defense, the government, the Defense Department, and we could not hire international students. I think it's typically in career fairs on job sites, they'll list the requirements of those roles. So make sure you're specifically looking for those opportunities that advertise to international students. Christina mentioned it as well about internships. Internships are a great way to get your foot in the door, especially before the year you graduate from your education. We look at internships as a low-cost way to evaluate candidates for future entry-level roles in the positions. And if the company's not hiring in the US, find the location elsewhere, right? Typically what companies will do is hire large internship classes, and then they'll convert those interns into entry-level positions. Especially if you're looking in the high-tech space, that's where you get into the realm of companies that will be able to sponsor them. And then you have your OPT, you can do the OPT extension, and then eventually H-1B, hopefully, if you win the lottery. One thing I did want to mention, someone mentioned J-1 visas in here. Be aware of remote work situations and how they can affect your visas as well. If you're an international student based outside of the United States, you typically would do a J-1 visa to do the internship. It's a cultural exchange visa. We actually last year, because of COVID and the remote working that we had, we couldn't offer J-1 visas because of the nature of the requirements of the J-1 visa that required the intern to be at a site to be working. And I'm sure Aaron can probably weigh in on that, but just be aware of how that affects your visa, right? One thing I would also say is advertise your language proficiency in both English, your native language, and any others, both written and verbal. Christina mentioned this on here about soft skills too, right? This is the key thing that I think you should mention on resumes. And then also to international students at international universities, be aware of home return residency requirements. This will impact your ability to seek full-time employment in the United States. I know that when I was recruiting at a tech company for students from China and some Eastern European countries, if you did an internship in the US or a limited amount of internships in the US, you had to stay in your home country for a significant amount of time before you could actually get full-time employment outside of your country. So just be aware of all these kinds of restrictions that may be in place if you're an international student looking to study, looking to do an internship or opportunity in the United States. Go to the next slide. So, this is, I put this slide together to give you kind of a little brief snapshot of policies. And again, this is a very general approach to policies. And I did it for two of the main industries I've worked in for the past 15 years, being biotech and pharma, which is for Roche, and then high tech or Silicon Valley tech companies when I've worked at Facebook, Uber, and Zillow. So generally, I'll go from a biotech pharma, international hiring practices. It's dependent on the role. I will tell you sometimes for OPT, CPT, typically, yeah, we will hire students for internships because there's no cost on that. But I think it gets a little bit more trickier when you enter the full-time space, right? We will hire international students. However, there is a cost, as Erin mentioned, to a sponsorship, right, for an H-1B. And that's where sometimes it's dependent on the budget for the role. Typically, high-tech or Silicon Valley companies, they are, for technical roles, when I used to recruit there, they would recruit as many students as they could find, and the sponsorship fees were not an issue for these companies. But again, it just depends on the size of the company. And again, this is just generalizations. One thing I do want to call out, if you're an international student at a non-US university, typically for an internship, yeah, we will hire you for an internship. It's really easy to bring you in on J1, but most companies are actually looking to convert their interns to full-time roles. That's where it gets a little tricky. As Aaron mentioned in his discussion, these students wouldn't have an OPT or a STEM extension to add on while they get the H-1B lottery. So we would be relegated to waiting for that lottery to happen for you, right? So you'd have to file in March, we'd wait till October to find out if you got it. And if you didn't get it, it resets the clock one whole year. So it is really dependent on the need and timeline. Some organizations really need talent in the door right away. They may not be able to offer you the opportunity to wait that long if you missed the lottery or didn't get awarded the sponsorship in the lottery. So just be aware of this kinds of things that are at play from an employer's perspective related to timing and the timeline that you're in. So go to the next slide, please. Advice to campus administrators: encourage students, I think, to keep on trying. I think remind students to do their homework before approaching or talking to a company. You might not want to send an international student to go talk to Lockheed Martin or a defense company because 9 times out of 10, they will not be able to employ non-US citizens in the role. Internship. Christina was mentioning about this. I say keep recommending and pushing students to do one, especially in their last year. I think Erin mentioned general life skills is to plan ahead. Generally, this is what I would recommend for all students, is to seek internship opportunities if you can do so, especially with CPT. And I actually got this one from a recruiter on my team. Encourage students to understand their own unique immigration situations and not rely on companies and recruiters to determine this for them, right? I think a lot of times, as we said, you got to own your own journey, understand some of the limitations and restrictions that you have for your specific situation. And then also, there's this typo here, but students should definitely get to know the staff at the International Students Office. I think they're invaluable resources to help you and shepherd you on this journey. If we go to the next slide. Guidance for international students. I saw a few questions here. Know how to answer the question, are you legally authorized to work in the United States? I know it's kind of a tricky one. If you're on an F1, you are legally authorized to work in the United States with your CPT. A company cannot ask you for your visa status. However, it does make it easier for the recruiter to assess this if you disclose it. So how typically in the thousands of interactions I've had is when we ask, are you legally authorized to work in the United States? A student would generally say, yes, I'm on an F1 visa, so I can get CPT. Or no, I am not legally authorized to work in the United States. I would have to apply for one. And then we kind of, in our head, we can start mapping the path that you may take, right? I'd say, again, reiterate to you, know your visa situation and requirements that are specific to you and what your situation is. I would say on a general guidance, your resume, and this is general tips on a resume, it's your chance to stand out. Highlight any qualifications and work experiences that make you unique, right? Some countries have military experience, so you may come in with managing a group of people, right? And that is skill sets and soft skills that you will have over, say, an American student who hasn't maybe gone through the military for their education point. So highlight all of these things that make you stand out, right? And in general, leverage your network. Use LinkedIn, get a referral. A lot of the traffic that comes into companies like Roche and a lot of tech companies are from referral traffic, right? Meaning that other employees have referred students that they know or people that they may be connected to into these roles. They do tend to get more priority in the queue in terms of reviewing by recruiters. And I think that is the last slide I have, Scott. Yeah, thank you.
All right. Thank you very much, Mr. Tay. That was outstanding. We got some good employer perspective there. And now for more employer perspective, let's go over to Scott Moore of Veris Insights. Scott, take it away.
Thanks, Scott. Clifton, Aaron, Christina, all of the information that you shared was super, super on point with what I'm about to talk about. So I'm just going to tell you a story of a student that I met a number of years ago and how they progress through this process. And it pulls from all of the things that my three predecessors here have just discussed. So I'm going to try to anonymize it as much as I can. So we'll just call her Jane. So I'm before I get into that, though, just to give you a little bit about my background so you understand where I'm coming from. I currently work at Veris Insights, which is a research firm. So we do research for university recruiting, and have about 250 members that are almost all Fortune 500 companies. So I'm currently advising these organizations on their university recruiting tactics. We do benchmarking surveys with the employers and also get student sentiment on their view of different things in the job market today. I've spent about 15 years in a direct university recruiting role. So I was the head of university recruiting at Zillow. Prior to that, I was the head of your university recruiting at Gap, big clothing company I'm sure you're all familiar with. Prior to that, I was with KPMG, very large multinational accounting and consulting firm. And prior to that, I worked for the American Institute of CPAs. For those of you that are accounting majors, you probably fear them because they write the CPA exam. But nevertheless, I've been working in the space for a while. So I wanted to tell you a story about one of the students that I met and kind of ushered through this process and some things that she did really well to help me out. So I met Jane on campus at a career fair, a typical career fair that we had, pre-COVID when we were doing things in person. So met Jane on campus. She approached me at the career fair, and the first question she asked me is, do you hire international students? And I love that she opened up the conversation that way because not all companies do. So her insight to be like, hey, let's throw that out on the table first. I'm going to be very open with you that this is the scenario that I'm in. And we at the time we did hire international students, so we're able to continue that conversation. Had I been with a company that did not, Jane would have immediately moved on to the next company rather than wasting her time or my time by continuing that conversation. The career fair is only 2 hours long. There's hundreds of companies to meet there. So take that time and use it critically. As soon as you get an answer from a company that they don't, rather than trying to convince them that they should, it's better off to use your time to go find companies that do hire international students, and you'll see how this plays out throughout the rest of the time. We took a stance that we wanted to hire international students because there is a big shortage of talent. Just like Clifton had mentioned earlier, it's even more evident today than it was years ago. But STEM positions, if you look at just the general, for your econ majors out there, the basics of supply and demand, if there is a low supply of students in that major and a high demand for students to be hired in that major, increases the likelihood that they are going to consider international students. So I talked to Jane for a little while at the career fair. We really hit it off. She left a resume with me. She sent me a follow-up email later on that night with a digital copy of her resume and said she was super excited. She had applied for the internship program and was really looking forward to moving forward into the process and meeting with other people at the organization. So she went through the whole interview process. Everything went great. We extended her an offer to join us, and she called me and she said, "Hey, Scott, really appreciate the offer. I have a couple of other offers from other companies as well, and I'm not sure which one to take. I really enjoyed meeting you and everybody else, but I have a couple of questions for you that I wanted you to answer." And all of her questions revolved around working with international students that required sponsorship and how our organization managed that process. And that was really key for her. And it showed a lot of self-awareness to me as well. It made me excited that we extended an offer to her. And I answered all of her questions for her. And then, me being the good recruiter that I am, I probed with her a little bit. And I was like, well, tell me about the other companies that you received offers from. So she had another offer that had a higher salary that went along with it. But they said that it would be only for an internship. There was a 0% chance that they would make her a full-time offer at the end of the internship. So even though the compensation for that internship was higher, she turned that offer down because her long-term goal was to find a full-time position here, right? There was another offer where the position had it was a little bit more in line with the scope of work that she wanted to do. Ours wasn't that far off, but this one was like the perfect fit. But they've never worked with international students before. And that threw up a red flag to her that she was like, even though that job maybe 100% of what I'm looking for, and yours is only 85%. She turned that offer down as well because she didn't have a lot of certainty that they knew how to manage the different things that you have to navigate. And Aaron talked about some of these intricacies a lot. And a company that partners with a fragment or a council that can really support that made a big difference for Jane in this process. So she ended up accepting our offer, even though it was a little bit less money and the job scope was just a little bit off of what she wanted. And this came to help out in a couple of ways down the road. So her internship went great. We made her a full-time job offer. She accepted that offer with excitement. Fast forward to she graduates and she's supposed to start. And one of the things that you need to get to provide to your employer when you start is an EAD card. Unfortunately, her EAD card did not arrive by the time of her first day, but she didn't panic. She was very upfront with us throughout the whole process. A week before, she sent me an email. It's like, "Hey, Scott, my card hasn't come yet. What do I do?" So I was able to connect her with people that had gone through that experience before, some professionals within our organization that could help support to help guide her through that. And the card didn't arrive by her first day. It didn't arrive on her second day, but her third day, when it was supposed to start, her card arrived. We brought her into the organization and things went smoothly. Had we not had that knowledge and had that situation happen before, that could have ended in a very different way, right? So that decision that she made way back when she accepted her internship offer actually helped her all the way through to that first day when she started full time. Fast forward 2 years, so she's on OPT. She submitted for the H-1B lottery on time. We did everything right as far as that process goes, did all the filings run on time. Unfortunately, she didn't win the lottery. Pretty heartbroken at that time. Not only was she, but also the team that she had been working with here in the US for 2 years had visions of things for her to do in the future. But we were a multinational organization. And Aaron had mentioned this in one of his slides. We ended up transferring her to our Singapore office. And because we have worked with international students for such a long time, we have professionals that spend literally their whole job just managing these types of scenarios. We were able to do it relatively seamlessly. Transferred her to Singapore. She spent 2 years there, learned a ton that she would have never learned by staying in the US, got exposed to a ton of international opportunities, learned a lot about or it was able to, I should say, leverage the 2 years experience that she had in the US in Singapore. So not only was she learning, she was actually teaching people as well. That experience really shaped the rest of her career. Fast forward 2 years later, she transfers back to the US into a different line of business because of that knowledge that she gained in Singapore. She always wanted in the back of her mind to stay in the US, but realized like this opportunity kind of was forced upon her, but she looked at it as a way to expand her knowledge, a way to be able to increase the way that she could contribute to the organization. And it actually pivoted her career into a different way. So she comes back to the US, ends up going into a different line of business here in a different office in the US. So she went from one city to another city because of that knowledge that she gained while she was in Singapore over those 2 years, right? So I guess there's a lot of different things that are tied into that story that you can pull from that, Christina had mentioned, Clifton had mentioned, Aaron has mentioned, but I think there's a couple of things here that are key takeaways from it. One, keep your options open. Keep an open mind on what could happen because you need to have a plan B, a plan C, a plan D in some of these scenarios because so much of it is out of your control. Take, maybe something that may be viewed as a negative outcome. Think about the opportunity that presents and how you can then utilize that opportunity to capitalize going forward. And then the other thing is, and a couple of them mentioned it, like start thinking about this stuff early, right? So when I first met her, it was her junior year of college. She was thinking long term about the way she's going to approach her career search and so forth. So the earlier that you can start to get ahead of these things, the better. And the more that you can be open and honest with everybody involved along in the process is going to help you kind of alleviate those concerns and prevent you from panicking when things do go wrong. So I'm excited to get your questions here later on, but I am going to pass the torch back to Scott to introduce our next speaker.
All right, thank you very much, Scott. Yeah, it's amazing how much we can learn from an individual's story that applies both to specific things and kind of to the overarching situation. Really appreciate you sharing that with us. Next up, so kind of shifting gears now to the perspective of the Career Services Office, we have Yang, who is the Associate Director of Global Careers at Duke, who are our gracious hosts this afternoon. So Mr. Yang, if you can take it from here.
Thank you so much, Scott. Thank you all for joining us today. And this first slide, I'd like to speak to our international student. As you know, there are many best practices, tips, strategies out there that you could incorporate to help with your studying, job searching, career planning, and so forth. And these are based on my personal experience. I've worked with lots of international students over the last couple of years. They're some of the best. So, and not surprisingly, Christina and Clifton and other folks have already provided great insights. So let me add my my thoughts. Getting acquainted with your international office, career center, student support services, and student boards early on in your study, right? So again, I don't want to repeat some of the talking points, but the takeaway point is that you want to be aware of all the resources available to you early on, so that you're in a position of being exposed to as many opportunities as you can. And in doing so, you can then be in the position to decide which workshops, right, which activities to attend, whether it's for personal or professional growth. So that's very, very important. Number two, learn how to network effectively, right? Create a LinkedIn profile early, conduct informational interviews to gain career information and expand your network. For a lot of the international student whom I met, throughout the years, this is one of the most underused and untapped resources until the very last minutes, right? So an important advice is that you want to start network early on, right? You want to create that LinkedIn profile. And, with being international students and with the limitations that you have, get to know folks who are already, who are in your field early on, right? Create that network so that by the time you're about to graduate, you have contacts, right? You have folks that you could turn to for advice. So that's very powerful. Number three, attend job fairs and events. Get to know employers, secure internship opportunities. I know Christina, Clifton, and other folks have mentioned already, but attending job fairs, that's probably going to be post-COVID, but is there really such a thing? So, for this one, I tend to get asked this question a lot from international student. Should I attend a career fair when I'm not looking for a job? The answer is yes, right? It's an opportunity for you to observe and ask questions, learn about professional etiquettes, right? This is a time for you to perhaps practice your elevator pitch, introduce yourself to employers, learn about which employer hire international students, right? So you don't have to, you don't have to be in a position to look for a job to attend career fairs and events. So I encourage you to take advantage of these fairs and events. All right. Number four, develop relationships with your professors, especially if you go to a large student body institutions with larger than average class sizes. I realize here at Duke, we don't have that problem. Coming from UC Santa Cruz, we do. So they're going to be a great resource to help you obtain research position, recommendation letters, and serve as job reference. And then number five, be proactive. I know Christina had mentioned this, and I would add, stay creative, right? Stay creative in the sense of if you are lacking a particular skill set for an internship position that you want to apply to, or if you're a sophomore, and for most folks that, oh, yeah. Next slide. Oh, no, next slide. I think Scott, you got it. No, not yet, Scott. Yeah, you got it. Yeah, so be creative, right? Create opportunities for yourself. I was saying you want to think about, perhaps you haven't professionally developed that skill yet, but maybe you already developed that skill in the classrooms or in your volunteer experience, right? So it doesn't have to always be professional. So be creative, think strategically, how to, polish that resume with the relevant experience to be able to apply for those positions. So stay creative, be proactive, stay creative. Next slide, Scott. And to my fellow career services professional, these are some of the best strategies that you can incorporate in your work to support the career needs of your international student if you haven't already. Create strategic career program partnerships with other campus partners to support the career and professional development needs of international students. Christina, I think Clifton as well, you two mentioned some great tips. And I would add that if you can collaborate, create programming workshops, right? Collaborate early on. During International Education Week would be one example. During International Student Orientation would be another great time to collaborate and be strategic. So that's number one. That's very important. Number two, repackage career content materials to tailor them to international students. More often than not, in career services, we already have great materials, right? It's just a matter of perhaps reframing the language that we go about delivering the content. So it's, add in that international piece, or framing it from an international student perspective. And so that's number two, think about that. Number three, be willing to meet international students where they are, virtually and physically. And so if you know that at your institution there's large pockets of international student, they're housed in a specific a location, perhaps be strategic about that, right? Create workshops and events in those locations, targeting those students. Maybe when you hold office hours, right? Perhaps dedicate office hours for international students, right? Talking about global opportunities. So that's number three, think about that. Number four, advocate for the hiring of international students to mutual employers and new employers, right? Sometimes we take this for granted. So you want to think about why are these employers, why are they not hiring international students, right? Perhaps they don't know the policies or the procedures, and it could be as simple as a student getting CPT, right? So be an advocate, right? Explain and take the time to inform employers that this is the process. It's very simple, right? So you just have to change a perspective, right? And that's number four. Number five, invest in platforms and resources that are inclusive of international students, right? And Christina had mentioned this already. Think in terms of newsletters relevant to international students. Subscribe to platforms such as Interstride. Perhaps create a dedicated web page for international students, sharing visa policies and procedures and relevant content from other international affiliated campus partners. So these are some great tips that I think you will find useful. So back to you, Scott. Thank you so much.
All right, thank you so much, Mr. Yang. That's good stuff. Now, for our final presenter of the evening, we have in addition to being an influential person in the international student space, he's also a former international student himself. Nitin Agrawal, take it away.
Thanks, Scott, and thanks everyone for joining today. My name is Nitin. So pretty much summarizing all the speakers here, I'm actually a product of the American education system, and a lot of the things that has been mentioned, at least from my experience, you have to be lucky as well. But at least from Aaron's journey that he drafted out for international students, I've gone through that exact channel. There was a small hurdle in there where you can see after the H-1B, I had to still leave the country, and I'll just talk through that and share my knowledge as an international student and professional, and at least some tips for other students, career advisors, and also employers who are on this call. So started my journey on F1 status like most other international students. During my undergraduate education, I was very proactive in pursuing internships, and not just internships, but also from big brand names. just so they would be recognized. It'd be easy to shine out when I was graduating. So these big brand names helped me secure an internship opportunity with Citigroup during my junior year, which converted to a full-time opportunity. And so the year that I graduated, this was 2006, the H-1B lottery was introduced for the first time. And there were, good 80,000 lottery. And so I remember that entire process was really nerve-wracking because I didn't know if I would receive it. If I didn't receive it, I didn't have any backup options. But thankfully, because Citigroup was such a large organization, they had a backup option laid out for me. They said, look, if you don't get your H-1B, no big deal. We'll send you to the London office. You can come back to the US a year later on an L1 visa. And so fortunately for me, at that time, I won the H-1B lottery, stayed in the country. But fast forward to my MBA program, after graduating from my MBA, I had to leave the country because I graduated around the financial crisis. And so I couldn't find an opportunity. But because I knew that L1 was an option, I worked abroad in Brazil and Norway with a large multinational energy conglomerate, and they brought me back to Houston on an L1 visa, which ultimately became green card. I received my US citizenship, and then I was able to also start Interstride because I was a US citizen. So there was my journey, and as Scott mentioned, as Clifton mentioned, just being flexible, open-minded, a lot of those tips are really valuable. And it's hard to understand sometimes at face value, but it's really, it can be very beneficial to have a very open mind as you go about it. Nowhere, so other than that H-1B period, nowhere during this entire journey did I feel really nervous, because I felt, I was doing the best I could at that given point of time. And so just, a few words here. I don't want to hold you from the Q&A that you have for the panelists here, but for employers as career advisors, all you need to highlight is, and some of this just echoing what Clifton mentioned, students on F1, when they are asked about their sponsorship today, if they are on STEM OPT, they can work up to 3 years. When the average turnover for a student is 1 or 2 years, if someone is able to work for 36 months, I don't think an employer will be offended if a student says, yes, I am authorized to work. So in up to 36 months for a STEM OPT, there is no work authorization required. And this is what we are trying, as we are rolling out an employer portal and trying to bring employers to our ecosystem to hire international students directly from Interstride. This is the message we are conveying to them as well. And so just to make sure that students don't need work sponsorship, at least for CPT, for OPT, for STEM OPT. And then if they do require H-1B, we'll connect them with the immigration lawyers, and we'll make sure that the process is really smooth. So it's not a big deal. And if they're a large company, they don't need to hire them in the US. They can place these international students just like they were willing to place me to their London office or the Toronto office or the Mexico City office or the home country, and bring them back on L1 if they want to, if the students want to come back to the US. So that really is the model that we are pursuing, and also making sure that employers from Singapore or from Hong Kong, or the international employers are also part of the platform. So if a student doesn't want to stay in the US, they can go abroad as well, because we assume that all students want to stay in the US and work in the US, but there's a large majority that wants to work in one of those metropolitan cities. So as you position, just keep in mind, these are some of the selling points for your international students. It's an untapped talent pool right now, where there's a talent crunch. And as Clifton mentioned, with the great resignation, this talent pool is still looking for jobs. And a lot of them are, almost 60% of this student population is STEM focused, which is in high demand, not just in the US, but Canada and abroad as well. Tends to be a very loyal employee base, either by choice or not really by choice, just mostly because of the visa issues as well. But there's very high retention rate. And also from a diversity standpoint, when you talk about diversity, this is real diversity, because an international student is not just diverse from a ethnicity or their racial standpoint, but culture, religion, language, education, experience, worldview. So it's real diversity that an international student is bringing to an organization. And to my fellow students here who are and this has been mentioned a couple of times. So start early, and by starting early, it doesn't mean you start, being anxious about the process. Starting early means just setting yourself some stepping stones. So as you close on to the graduation, you're prepared. So take advantage of your CPT as you are closing into the graduation. Make sure you've applied for your OPT on time. Also, some couple of things that you can do in this process, making sure that your major will actually lead to a job. If your goal is to stay in the US, there are certain degrees, and some of that was mentioned by Scott and Clifton earlier today. Those jobs have very high potential or chances to get sponsorship because employers are looking for those roles for degrees. Certain degrees don't have the same attractive value to an employer just because there's a lot of domestic competition, and also the job market is not as hot for certain positions. So when you speak to your career advisors, try to understand what these courses are. If you're a freshman, sophomore, you can position yourself, take the right courses, and really gear up for graduation. That can make a lot of difference as well, because you have actually taken the right courses that can set you forward in the future. Also, just make sure your OPT applications are done on time. And lastly, again, this has been mentioned, just echoing and summarizing here, backup plans. So just like when I graduated from my master's program, I didn't get my H-1B, but I had an international job lined up. Took that job. I knew if I worked for them for a year or 2 years, I could request the company to relocate me to the US. They did that. And pretty much that brings me to one last point, is be careful about seeking sponsorship from a startup. So, and this, I would love to hear Aaron's thoughts later, and also Scott's and Clifton's thought. But with a startup, there's no problem with the job and the work you'll do. But say if they are applying for your H-1B and the H-1B is oversubscribed, and realistically, you have 1 in 3 shot of getting the H-1B. With a large employer, again, they can relocate you abroad. They can there are multiple options. They have an entire mobility team. But with a startup, they're really infant in this process. So you might be the first recruit. You might be the first one of the first international recruits. And so if you get your H-1B denied, they might not have a backup option. So that's where I suggest, at least for the first job out of school, you look for large Fortune 500 or Fortune 5,000 companies who have this infrastructure within the company to sponsor you, but also if sponsorship fails, they can relocate you. So just regarding the backup options here, so the H-1B is obviously your default option. If your H-1B is denied, you can ask the employer to relocate you to a foreign office. If you are a postdoc and if you are a graduate student, national interest waiver and cap exempt options are also applicable. Cap exempt, as Aaron mentioned, can also be relevant to undergrads as well. But explore some of the other immigration options that might be relevant to you. And lastly, explore international options. We'll be looking at, especially for STEM OPT, we are partnering with a company in Canada where you can get citizenship in 4 years and permanent residency in 2 years, because there's such a war for STEM talent. And so you can find opportunities, especially if you're pursuing a STEM degree in the US. So last slide here for advisors. Partner closely with your ISS office. Christina mentioned, provided some suggestions here, but really staying close to the ISS office, keeping up to date on the visa and immigration information, and just having them as a partner will allow you to better support your students. Partnering with the alumni office can help you connect international alumni through your current students. Many universities, at least in my experience, have not done that. And I've been working with a few, 100 universities, and very few have been able to accomplish this. But I really think this is very crucial, not just to engage your current students, but also to engage international alumni. So if the Career Services International Student Office and the Alumni Office can work together, that makes a global organization in terms of the institution being global, because you are able to successfully engage your international alumni. And they could be anywhere in the 100+ countries in the world. And lastly, there's also many universities, we don't see an international student champion. There is no one advocating for international students. So you have the opportunity to be this champion. because it is a demographic which is not just relevant to your institution, but the entire US education system. So you could be this champion, and from a career standpoint as well, it will bear fruits in the future. And last here, so just I've said last like a few times, but these are my final slides. So just setting up checkpoints over the course of the period, over a student's journey, to make sure they're informed can also really benefit students. And these are some of the channels that we use, whether you have technology or not. And if you're looking how to better support international students, these are some of the ways you can support them as well, because ultimately it all comes down to how you can best reach students. And these are some of the channels that at least we use to support our students. So with that being said, I'll pass it back to Scott, and we'll open up for some moderator questions.
All right. Well, thank you everyone for your great presentations. Now we're going to move on to the questions that we prepared ahead of time. And maybe I'll start with this one. Several times it was mentioned as a backup plan, and maybe I'll direct this question to Clifton, to you to start with. It was mentioned as a backup plan to have an international option. Is there anything that students need to do ahead of time to make sure that even that backup option is more open to them? Or is that the type of thing that when it comes up, you can just get flipped over as easy as it sounds?
I think it depends on the company, right? I think to a little bit what Scott mentioned and also Aaron mentioned, it depends on the company. It depends on how large of a company or how national or global, a company is. I know I worked at Facebook earlier on, and we had the lottery, and a lot of our software engineers didn't get their H-1Bs, and then we opened an office in Canada, which allowed them to get to legally work there easier. So I think it just depends on the company. I would say there's no like guaranteed option. I think what we're trying to say in this whole discussion is that flexibility is key, and I think you should always have a backup plan to your backup plan. I also think transparency, being open with kind of your situation and what you're willing to do and not willing to do, is also a great piece of information to have kind of set aside for your own benefit, right? Before you jump into this kind of crazy process of navigating international work.
I'll add one thing to that real quick. Academic calendars from country to country are not always the same, right? So like if you're looking at, Australia compared to the US, they're somewhat similar. If you're looking at other countries, they may not be. So the recruiting timelines in another country may be very different than the recruiting timeline that you're experiencing here in the US. So that does, kind of lead into what Clifton had said, where you definitely need to be more proactive than reactive in that scenario. You probably know what the academic calendar is in your own home country, assuming, but if you are open to other countries as well that maybe have easier immigration laws from your home country, like that's something to look into way in advance as well.
Awesome. The number that got thrown around is 85,000. That's the number of H-1Bs available. Aaron, what's the rationale behind that number? I understand it's not enough. Does that come from somewhere? Was that pulled out of nowhere? Will that number be changing anytime soon?
That number was determined by Congress. It used to be higher. Probably about 15 years ago. It's been 85,000 for quite some time. We've been advocating that, not that they necessarily increase it, but that they have a system in place where it can fluctuate based on the economy, based on the job market. Because, in 2008 or 2009, we didn't get enough, back then when we had the recession, it would have made sense for them to lower the number. And then this year, with the way things are, it would be great if they could expand that number, but it just isn't something that can be easily done without an act of Congress. And we know that is not an easy feat right now.
Right. It's so interesting, right? It's something that's so important, and it's literally a lottery. Is there anything, you mentioned that there's not, is there anything someone can do to increase their chances in this lottery, or is it truly drawing a number?
It's just one factor only. It's if you have a U.S. earned advanced degree, master's, PhD, that gives you an advantage. And so of the 85,000, 20,000 of those are specifically for U.S. master's degree earners. And then the other 65,000 is for everyone, people with masters, people with masters abroad, people with bachelors. So that's really it. Now, there was a proposal to allocate H-1Bs based on salary being offered instead of by lottery. This doesn't look like it's going to move forward. And I had a lot of concerns with it, especially because students that are starting off in the job market are often on the lower end of the pay scale. And I think it would have probably hurt a lot of them and hurt people working in fields that don't necessarily pay a lot. So there were some troubling aspects to that, but at the end of the day, it does not look like that's going to move forward.
Yang, what are some characteristics or qualities that we see in students who are successful in this endeavor? If you were kind of profiling someone who's going to do well in this, looking at all things being equal, what would you recommend? Mr. Yang, yeah.
I would say, the big piece for me, having worked with, lots of international students, I tell them you're gonna have to take your time to have patience and stay positive, understanding that the job search is a process and that there will be rejections along the way. But at the end of the day, you only need one yes, right? So staying positive, rejection is part of the job search process, and I would add in there that, it's really about, when it comes to quality too, it's really about your resume. I see more often than not, students don't tailor their resume. So you gotta have to take your time, have patience, tailor resume, relevant keywords from the job description, run it through an ATS system. Just be patient with the job search process. That would be one, I would say you gotta have that patience.
Anyone else have some kind of profiling of a successful student in this process?
I'll jump in. I've worked with international students for many years, and some key traits really stand out to me. I think everyone's experience is different, but the students that I've seen really take advantage of, working on campus before they're eligible for CPT or OPT, because it's developing leadership skills, whether it's an on-campus job or maybe even if it's not an on-campus job, it's joining student organizations and maybe taking an active role in that to develop leadership, build your network, and try to get involved in the community. Getting to know people outside of university campus, whether it's through volunteering, whether it's, if you're religious, joining a religious organization, or, community cleanup event, like you get to meet people that are connections. And it's through those connections that I've seen some students really be able to not only build their network, but come across opportunities that they might not have otherwise know about or learned about. But taking advantage of doing curricular practical training when they can, because if you can do some internships before graduation, that really helps you to get your foot in the door with a company. And I've seen many students get an internship through an authorization through CPT and to stay on with that company and then apply for post-completion OPT. And that company, you already have the relationship with that company, you've already proven yourself, and they've gone on and been sponsored at the H-1B. So I think those are some things that I've seen over the years that have really stood out.
Awesome. Thank you very much. Mr. Moore, if someone's looking to get an opportunity, maybe in their home country or a specific country, does it help to reach out personally, or is that considered kind of circumventing the process? What would you recommend if someone maybe is from a certain country, has that in mind? Should they be reaching out themselves?
Absolutely. Every company is going to handle it a little bit differently. But in a lot of cases, the location in their home country may be almost an independent entity, but have some kind of like relationship. But usually, and I'd love for Clifton to chime in on this too, generally speaking, recruiting teams recruit for one specific country. So while we're recruiting here for the United States positions, I have very little knowledge about my peer that's working in China or England or somewhere else, right? So I might be able to help make that connection, but I would not be offended at all if a student that is based here in the U.S. reaches out to one of my peers in another country. So I would encourage to try both channels, to be honest. But I love Clifton to chime in too.
Yeah, please.
Yeah, I would just adding into that, I would say you can never have your resume in too many places, right? I would say it's kind of the notion the saying I always tell students. I think as if you're really honing in on a company and you want to apply for that and you want to get a job there, do whatever it takes. I think put your job, your resume in for the role you want to apply for in different locations. I would also leverage your network. I will tell you the value of leveraging your network. Find connections that are located in these offices or these locations or in departments, right? You never know. I got my job at Facebook as a recruiter because my fraternity brother was worked in the help desk at Facebook at the time. And I also had another connection that one of my clients at GE was cousins with Dustin Moskovitz. These are the random connections that you get and that you leverage that end up in careers and jobs. So I would say leverage that network, find those connections, and reach out to as many people as you can. Right. I think flip side of that though is don't be annoying. There's I think a fine line of like being, because I think Scott, any recruiter here can laugh, right? Because we know those types of students within reason, right? Try to make meaningful connections. Don't just blast 1,000 people in a company, right? Have those meaningful connections and something meaningful to say.
And this can be for anyone, maybe Ms. Khan, maybe you can start. It would be a shame for someone not to have the resources to be able to participate in this process in the right way. But what's the best way to use the resources? Perhaps a career services office at the school. What's the best way to engage with those resources that you do have?
Yeah, so I mean, if you're an enrolled student, you are paying lots of tuition and fees and you are paying for these services. So use them. And if you don't know where to start, like walk into their office. And I know maybe that's harder to do during COVID. If your university's a hybrid or whatever, check out their website. Usually there's information about upcoming workshops, information online. I know for at UCF, the International Student Services Office, our office, as well as the Career Services and our Experiential Learning Office, which handles more internships before graduation. We do a lot of programs together specifically for international students. And so that's a great starting place, is to maybe go to an event that's already happening, gets your foot wet, you kind of meet the people, you kind of figure out what resources might be available. And then most offices will offer, and I'm sure Yang and others can chime in, will offer services in terms of like helping you review your resume, maybe even do some mock interviews to really help yourself prepare and feel more confident, and also just have another set of eyes look on your materials as you are applying.
Does anyone else have input on that before we shift gears to the audience Q&A?
Yeah, I agree. Absolutely, Christina. Engage with your career services office at the very beginning of your time of study. You want to establish a rapport relationship, right, with the folks there. Come to us. We'll create a network and support system to guide your professional growth. Create periodically check-ins with the advisors, making sure that you are developing the appropriate career readiness competencies, right, to maximize your professional growth. And ultimately, you're going to be ready, career ready, right, if you set those schedules and meetings.
All right. Well, thank you very much. We have lots of questions from the audience. I'll start with you, Mr. Blumberg. We have one from one of our attendees. And here's the question. Mostly all the internship applications have this question. Do you now or ahead in the future require sponsorship? If a student is on an F1 visa and they do look forward to sponsorships after the OPT, what is the ideal answer to this question? When do you know that the system will automatically drop your application if perhaps you show interest but don't answer ideally? How do you cope with that question, that situation?
Great question. I get asked this all the time, and I'm curious to hear what Scott and Clifton have to say after me. So the thing is, what I find flawed is that when they ask the question, normally you only have two options, yes or no. And the problem is that for, I'd say, most students, it's not a black and white yes and no question. I think usually it's a maybe, but that's not an option. And so I don't know that there really is not a good way to answer this, especially if you have like a STEM extension where you have 3 years of work authorization. Will you require sponsorship in the future? You're asking a 22-year-old to predict what they're going to need in 3 years. That's really, really tough to do. Maybe they want to go home after the 3 years, but then they start working and realize, actually, I want to stay. So it's really challenging. I always recommend to students that if you're just filling out an application and answering these questions and that's it, you're not going far enough. I think you need to reach out to a recruiter, someone you know, someone you meet on LinkedIn, and explain your situation, because you're in a unique situation. Most people that are being hired are Americans, and you're in the minority. And so you need to just advocate yourself and explain to someone, listen, I put no, but I'm not really sure. Or I put yes, but I'm not sure about that. So that's my advice. But like I said, I'd love to hear what Scott and Clifton think about that as well.
Please.
So we get this question all the time, and my short answer is say yes, you will require sponsorship, because the way the question is worded, we're not asking about specific today, we're not asking in the next year or the next 2 years or the next 5 years, we're asking in the future, which is a very long time. The worst thing that can happen is you say no. We go through the entire interview process, we get to extend you an offer, you're super excited about it, and then we find out that you do require sponsorship and this position is not eligible for that. And then you put all of that time and energy in all the excitement that goes into it. We get excited about you, and at the end of the day, it's not going to work out, right? So to prevent heartache like that, I would encourage you to say yes. There are some situations where some positions that we have are open to sponsorship and some positions are not. So if you happen to apply to a position that isn't open, but you're honest about it on the front end and say yes, I can very easily talk to you about a different position that you may be interested in that could have saved all of that kind of hardship at the beginning, right? I 100% agree with what Aaron said, though. Really talk to a recruiter, find out if they've hired international students in the past, talk to somebody like Christina and ask her if she knows anything about the organization, and there's an alumni that you can talk to. Utilize your network in that scenario as well. But in almost all cases, I would really encourage you to say yes, just to prevent bad things from happening down the road.
Yeah, I would just echo Scott's sentiment, say yes. I would also say if you did say no and find yourself into this interview process, mention it up front. Always tell the recruiter. I always like to me, like your immigration status to me is not some big scary thing to be concerned about. I think just talk to the recruiter. And more than that, I tell my recruiters, their job is to shepherd candidates through this process, right? So Scott mentioned we can typically find other roles that may be a fit for you, or refer you to different locations. Always be upfront and transparent with the recruiter, right? It's not, to me, it's not a cat and mouse game. And I hate that kind of connotations that sometimes recruiters have with candidates, especially when it comes to like negotiations and things like that. Just be upfront and transparent. And I think if you did say no, let them know right away in the beginning of the process. A lot of times too, for companies like us or Roche, where we operate in a lot of environments, we actually have to do an immigration evaluation at the first step of the process, even before we actually consider you for an interview. We have to vet you through our immigration attorneys and legal teams to ensure that everything's aligned. Then we start the interview process. So it just depends on the company, it depends on the process, but I always think upfront and transparency is always the key.
All right, thanks. Thanks, everybody. We have another question here from Paola. Maybe Aaron, you can start us with this one as well. What means that an employer is exempt from the H-1B lottery? How long is that process of getting an H-1B taking, especially with the COVID situation? And is it a good or a bad thing for a job seeker that a company is exempt from the H-1B process?
So it's a great thing, and it's something that's really underutilized. And I know Christina will attest that working for a university, I think, is a wonderful place to work. And so the primary cap exempt employers are universities. And so what it means is that they don't have to file in that lottery in March. They're exempt. And so any day of the year, a university could sponsor you for an H-1B. It's pretty quick process, especially if they pay for what's called premium processing, which guarantees a decision on your case in 15 days. So I think it's a great option. I think, the thing is that a lot of students are lured by, the big tech companies, the big investment banks. And I think that sometimes a university is maybe not as attractive to some people. But I think it's a great way to stay in the country. It's a great way to get an H-1B, university sponsor for green cards. And a myth is that a lot of people think you have to be a professor to get this cap exemption, but you don't. You could be at a place like UCF as a budget analyst or a HR coordinator or anything like that. It does not have to be a professor or a researcher.
Okay, well, thank
So,
you very much. Yeah, go on.
Scott, I can take one question here from one of the administrators. So the information presented by all panelists today has been very helpful. However, I noticed that the trend of all the talking points specifically focusing on what students need to do and what the students need to do to validate their skills, status. I'm wondering if anyone can speak to what employers might be doing to actively market themselves to international students or validate why their company opportunities are international student friendly. It seems as though the majority of the burden is on the student to have to defend why they are worthy of being hired when they are ahead already so many requirements and pressures put on them, as opposed to the companies advertising why they want to hire international students or at a minimum sharing the burden. So Clifton, Scott, any thoughts there?
Yeah, I mean, I saw that question and I was about to respond to that. I mean, I think to answer your part of the question, I think companies show that they want to employ, I think, international students by offering the sponsorship, offering premium processing, working with candidates to be flexible. I do understand, though, I think if you're kind of on the student side, it feels like a lot. It feels like a lot to deal with, or it feels like I have a whole crap ton of things that are weighing on my shoulders and it's more stuff to deal with. I will tell you the reality is that's the way life is, unfortunately, right? And I think that's kind of, it's just the way it works. And unfortunately, that's kind of how, but it kind of nets itself out. That being said, I think companies you will find are typically, and I answered another question about how the international students have connotations of not wanting to work at a company for so long, expensive, things like that. I think there definitely are companies out there. I've worked at many of them that hire en masse international students and are flexible. They work with them. They've, Scott and I mentioned recruiters that work to find locations. I can't tell you how many dozens of times that has happened in my experience with one-off cases. And we do our ultimate most, from my experience, I inadvertently hired a Cuban national who was going to a Canadian university working to the US. Didn't know that until we were about to make the offer. And that was my fault when I was a recruiter. We ended up waiting 2 years for this student, but he came to work at the company and got a full-time offer, and he's working at the company now. So I think it's the process. I don't think companies advertise that types of things as much because it is very personal situations for personal candidates, right? But I do think some of the indicators you should look for are if they do offer sponsorship, right? Like I said, leverage that network, get a sense of what the company's like. Go to Glassdoor, go to Reddit, go to Quora, look up these kinds of things and get the perspective from other international employees that work there of what it's really like, right? I can tell you that I think the companies that do hire en masse international students, I think you may not feel like that they're marketing specifically to you, but I think if you can kind of factor in all the other things that we kind of talked about, diversity, inclusion, cultural sensitivity, things like that, I think that comes out in the wash, if so to say. So I don't know if that answers that question specifically, but I think there are things that are indicators that show they're open and willing and want to share this burden that you talk about.
I'll only add one thing to it. I think Clifton summed it up perfectly. Only one additional piece is you have to think about hiring an international student comes with a higher level of risk and a greater cost to the business. Right. So you remember Aaron had referenced the fees that have to be paid. I mean, it's $5,000, $10,000 per. The odds that you win the lottery are 1 out of 3. So, businesses that are willing to do it are taking a big risk and putting forward more money for it. So it is a big investment for them to do it. So, kind of take that with a grain of salt that the reality is, I don't want to say companies don't want to, but they do it more out of need than anything, because of that supply and demand issue within the labor market that we talked about before. Personally, I had an experience trying to go the other way. I tried to get a job in another country. I've tried to do this twice now. Tried to get a job in another country and have been unsuccessful both times because of these types of situations. So it's just as challenging for us to try to go somewhere else as it is for other people to try to come here. So it's more of, in my mind, it's kind of a global issue. And those companies were open to it, but also at the same time weren't promoting it. It was more along, I had to try to find my own way. So, you do have to put forth the extra work, but if something that you really want and really drive towards, it's possible.
Well, thank you very much. I really appreciate our panel. Thanks to all of you who joined us on this event today. And don't forget, this entire presentation will be available and sent to everyone who's observed today. You can also find it as a recording on a future episode of the Interstride podcast. I hope you found today's show to be useful and that we've helped to demystify the sometimes maybe oblique world of international student hiring. You can keep up with Interstride at our LinkedIn page or Instagram app that I've posted in the chat here. And if you or someone you know would be a great guest for a future panel or perhaps a guest on the Interstride podcast, please follow the link that I've also posted in the chat to let us know and reach out about that. Once again, thank you very much to our panel. I really appreciate all your guys' time. We know you're very busy, especially as that those 20 days in March approach. So thank you very much, everyone. And thanks for joining us today. And be safe, thanks, and be well.